Colm Tóibín is the author of 8 novels, including Nora Webster, that which we're here to celebrate tonight, 2 collections of short stories, and other works of nonfiction and drama. Among the many prizes his writing has earned are the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in 2004 for his novel The Master, and the Costa Novel Award in 2009 for Brooklyn. In Nora Webster, Colm Tóibín has created a character so well defined, so easy to relate to, so real in her humanness, that it's easy to forget that she's made up. In his rave review in the Washington Post, Ron Charles said, "Readers in search of flaming buildings and libidos should turn the page now." It's true, the drama in Nora Webster is the stuff of real life. A young son reaction to his mother's new hairdo, the negotiation of politics in the workplace, and it's the complexity of real emotion, the sorrow for losing a loved one mixed with the feeling of freedom that comes along with it. Nora Webster endures as a novel because she inhabits a place in our consciousness and in our hearts. Colm Tóibín is truly one of the greatest writers writing today, and we are proud and honored to be hosting him here tonight. So please help me give a warm Politics and Prose welcome to Colm Tóibín.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It's raining outside, so it's good to be indoors at least. I'll start with the politics. This book opens, I suppose, in 1968 in Ireland, and Nora Webster's husband has died, and she's in her 40s, and she has no money. And some of this book comes from memory, where, in those years, I'm still talking about politics. The last thing a child of 12, and I'm 12 and 13, 14 around this time, wants to watch is the annual speech of the Minister for Finance about changes in the budgets. But for 2 or 3 of those years, we were watching it. I don't know, was I watching it, or was I just called in to come in quickly and watch? Because my mother thought he had said that there was going to be an enormous increase in the widow's pension, and that it was going to be backdated. Now, the backdated part, we didn't know what that meant, but it meant that a lump sum, and the word is etched in my mind. It's like when Mary Tudor, when she lost Calais, said the word Calais was engraved in her heart. The word lump sum. The lump sum cheque for 3 of those years arrived tax-free, utterly free, not earned, a lump sum, a big cheque arrived in our house in the post. So we watched the next year's budget speech with Charles Haughey, who was later much vilified in Ireland. But they always said, his mother had been a widow. He understood widows. He understood the difficulty of trying to bring up children without a main breadwinner, because women in those years were not considered to be main breadwinners. And the second year there was also a huge increase in the widow's pension, and we watched the television with awe and wonder. And then, of course, we're coming into the October 68, summer of 69, when suddenly the television changes again to, you shout, come down, there's something on the television. And so, well, what? And it looked like it could be something happening here, like civil rights marches, protests, police. No, it was Derry, it was Belfast, it was our country, or at least it was a part of our country we didn't know. And that was coming close to us as another aspect of things was happening. And the third thing that matters in this book, it matters to the boy, is the moon landing. So it's those years, this book happens in those years. And I'm going to read 2 bits from the book, and the first bit, in the opening chapter, Nora has gone back to the house that herself and her husband, small house they had actually bought on the Wexford coast in the southeast of Ireland. She realised she can't afford to keep it. She needs the money. Also, she doesn't ever want to go back there. So she resolves, I will never come back to this place. But in these 2 chapters, she comes very close to this place. This place is a stretch of the Wexford coast. In the mid-1980s, the Irish painter Tony O'Malley, who'd been living for many years in Cornwall in St Ives and painting there, had a touring retrospective in Ireland, which came near to the town of Enniscorthy, where I'm from, where this book is set. And he decided to visit the town after all the years. He'd been a bank clerk in the town about 38 years earlier, and he hadn't been there for all that time. And of course, it's not very long, 38 years, so he was recognised by everybody, and including the daughter of the boarding house where he had stayed, who greeted him warmly, who was very popular. And as she was going away, he said, "Oh, by the way, that suitcase that you left is still there for you." A suitcase. So he went eventually and realised that his wife had said to him, the woman whom he married after all of this, had said to him, "There's a lot of your work missing. There, from period, top full to the brim with drawings, gouaches, watercolours of the town of Enniscorthy and of a part of the Wexford coast, Ballyconnegar, Blackwater, Cush Gap." But the problem was that the drawings he'd made of the town were exact. They were almost topographical, but the ones from the coast, anyone would think, well, he must have made them up. But the reason was that it's an eroding coast. So the drawings and gouaches and watercolours he made of the hill behind Keating's house in Ballyconnegar, which is the beach of Blackwater, the hill is gone. It's not there anymore, but his drawings are there. And so this place that Nora goes back to, or very close to, she goes back to the village of Blackwater in this opening thing I'm going to read. Second one, she actually goes very close onto the beach, or the strand as it's called itself. And her husband, well, I'll come to that in a second. Her husband was called Morris. But what's happened in the first one is that a woman, people just don't know what to do about her because she's not going out anywhere. It's a small town, and everyone's watching her because they're interfering in her business on one side. On the other side, they're making sure she's okay. And no one knows how to do either of these things properly. And she feels almost trapped by the two things. But anyway, a woman comes, and it looks like an excuse to say, "Look, we need someone to keep the score at a quiz which is going on in a village. Will you keep the score?" And she can't, she just forgets to say no. And then, of course, forgets to ask where. And then, of course, it's too late when she finds out it's Blackwater, the very place where, and suddenly she has to go there because it's too late to pull out of it. So anyway, the woman in charge of the quiz, who does these quizzes all over the place, is called Phyllis Langdon. Part of the problem, I suppose, between Irish usage, or I think it would be the same in England, and here is the word vet, V-E-T, would mean in Ireland a veterinary surgeon, a doctor for animals, whereas here it could have a different meaning, but just in Ireland it wouldn't have that meaning. So when it says her husband was a vet, please realise that her husband is She had met Phyllis Langdon a number of times over the years. Her husband was a vet, and both of them were from Dublin. Dublin, by this time, even still to this day, actually, is quite a distance, even though it's only an hour and a half, psychologically or socially or intellectually or emotionally. It's a very long way away. People don't like Dublin people. Her husband was a vet, and both of them were from Dublin. She noticed how efficiently Phyllis reversed the car and admired the beautiful rings on her fingers as Phyllis changed gear and they set off towards Blackwater. "What's amazing," Phyllis said, "is how much they all know about sport." These are the people in the quiz. "And how little they know about anything else. On politics, mind you, they're not too bad, and on geography maybe, or even history. But questions about books and music have them all flummoxed. You'd wonder if they went to school at all." And who makes up the questions? Nora asked. "Oh, I do all that. I get advice about the sport. We start with easy questions, and they have quiz books, but I only take a few questions from books just to make them feel that it's worth preparing. Last week in Monageer, there was a team, and they knew nothing. They didn't even seem embarrassed. If you'd asked them to add 2 and 2, they would have looked as though they were required to explain Einstein. I suppose they joined for the fun of it," Nora said. "Ignorance is bliss," Phyllis said. I'm sure some of them are very nice," Nora said. "Oh, nice as you like. and as thick as planks. They turned right at Finchog and did not speak again until they were on the other side of the balloch. Nora could feel Phyllis's deep seriousness about the task ahead and resolved to make no light remarks about the failure of contestants to answer the questions she had prepared. She saw now why Nancy Brophy, who's the woman who'd come to ask, had wanted someone who was good at figures to keep the score. By the way, Phyllis said, I have a notebook and some good pens for you. We start with 2 rounds of 2-mark questions that a child could answer. It warms things up. And then we go on to 2 rounds of 3-mark questions, then 4-mark, then 5 rounds of 6-mark questions that separate the sheep from the goats. In the first rounds of 6, only the individual contestants can answer. But in the last rounds of 6, the whole team can answer. It must take a lot of work preparing the questions, Nora said. I like to get a variety, and a good team like the Oil Gate team will spend weeks preparing, reading up on subjects they might not know much about. So it's very educational, Nora said. For some, not for others, Phyllis said. When they arrived in the village, Phyllis said that she was surprised that the arrangement was to meet the organisers in Etchingham's pub, that she didn't normally go into pubs, but they would make their way to the hall beside the church as soon as they possibly could. She refused an offer of refreshment for both of them. We'll need to keep our wits about us, she said, so we'd like a jug of water and some ice and 2 glasses, and we'd have the same on the table in the hall. The teams were to be from Blackwater itself and from Kilmuckridge. Nora was busy drawing lines down the centre of the pages of the notebook, so she did not see that Tom Darcy from Cush, and Cush is where herself and her husband had the house and where they went for the summers for the children all the years, was standing at the bar. Still in his work clothes, he approached their table. Nora, what way are you? He asked. Tom, I didn't see you there, she said. Are you in for the quiz? We might stay for the fun, he said, but there again we might not. Sure, we know all the answers, Nora. For a moment, Nora was going to introduce Tom to Phyllis, but because of the stiffness she sensed in Phyllis, Nora knew that she did not want to be introduced to a man in his work clothes, with the easy familiar manners of Tom Darcy. How's Mrs. Darcy? Nora asked. As right as rain, he said. She'll be delighted when I tell her I met you. Now, do I know that woman beside you? I'd like to tell the missus who I met when I was out. Oh, Phyllis Langdon, this is Tom Darcy, Nora said. Phyllis nodded, but did not offer her hand to Tom. Oh, Phyllis Langdon, he said, the woman that asks the questions. She's the terror of Mona Gear. Nora could feel Phyllis beside her recoiling from Tom Darcy, who in turn had no intention of returning to the bar until he had ferreted out as much information as possible to take home with him. I heard they know nothing in Mona Gear, he said. It was clear that Tom was addressing himself to Phyllis, but she made no reply. I heard that they are as ignorant as what you might find on the floor of a pigsty. And I'm not talking about straw, he went on. And how are they all in Cush? Nora asked. Pulling the divil be the tail, the few that are left, Tom said. I'll tell you one thing now, you were sorely missed. We were just saying that the other day. You were the best of the bathers. You always were. The people who live along that coast call people who go to swimming in the sea bathers. And people who go for the summer bathers, because they would never dream, the local people, of getting into the sea for any reason. And so you were the best of the bathers. You always were. Excuse me now, Phyllis interrupted, but we will have to go up to the hall soon and make sure the contestants know where they are sitting. Sure, that crowd from Kilmuckridge wouldn't know their elbow from a hole in the wall, Tom said. Ask them how to spell GAA. GAA is the Gaelic Athletic Association, which is a sport. That'll put manners on them. Manners, Phyllis said pointedly. Will you have a drink, the two of you? We will not, Phyllis said. Nora watched as Tom walked across to the bar and drew the barman's attention to herself and Phyllis. Will you have a baby sham? A sherry or a brandy? He shouted over. Nora shook her head and then turned to Phyllis, who was busy checking through the questions. There was a red mark on each of her cheeks that seemed to have emerged during her encounter with Tom Darcy. The barman came over with a baby sham and a brandy and soda. "Did we not say that we wanted only water?" Phyllis asked, "and we don't have time." "The customer's the boss here, ma'am," the barman said, "and you can bring them up to the hall with you as long as I get those glasses back." "That'll crown you now," Tom Darcy shouted over. "Have you known that man for long?" Phyllis asked her. "I've known him all my life," Nora said calmly as she poured the baby sham. "I'm afraid I can't drink brandy. It has a bad effect on me." "We should go now," Phyllis said, "and I think it would be a mistake to be seen carrying drinks through the village. Even though Guinness is the sponsor, this is the last time I will agree to meet in a pub." She gulped down the brandy and soda. The hall, when they arrived, was filling up. Some of the people Nora knew by name, others by sight, and then there were people whom she did not know at all, but their way of standing at the doorway, or close to the wall at the back, or looking around them, had something familiar about it. It was both shy and at ease, both friendly and reserved. It made her feel that she knew them as well as she'd ever known anyone here. As the teams identified themselves, Phyllis grew more authoritative. She stood up regularly to make sure that the space between their table and the seats where the contestants would sit was being kept clear, and then insisted that no one could loiter close to the contestants during the quiz to prompt them. There were 3 men and 1 woman on each team. As Phyllis explained the rules, she produced from her bag a stopwatch that she set to sound an alarm after 10 seconds. Nora studied the contestants. One of the men she knew from Blackwater was a retired teacher, and the woman beside him had been on a committee of the Irish Countrywomen's Association. The next in line looked to her like a schoolboy, and the last, she supposed, was a farmer. As Phyllis spoke, an atmosphere of solemnity came over the contestants. It was, Nora thought, as though the priest had come out onto the altar, or the teacher had arrived in the classroom. The first questions were so simple they were almost insulting. Phyllis asked them, however, as though they were challenging and would require much jogging of memory. Her voice was like that of a continuity announcer on the radio, and it had, when she pronounced certain words, an English edge to it. Nora saw how easy it was going to be to keep the score, but noticed also that Phyllis kept a supervisory eye on what she was writing down during the second and third rounds as the scores started to vary. As she came to the 4 mark questions, a man produced another brandy and soda for Phyllis and another baby sham for her. Nora had no idea who brought these drinks, as Tom Darcy had not followed them to the hall. By the time the 6 mark questions began, the Blackwater team was slightly ahead. In a round of sports questions, there were cheers from the body of the hall when some pertained to the GAA. This caused Phyllis to demand silence for the next round, questions about classical music. How many symphonies did Brahms compose? Phyllis asked. Nora watched the man from Kilmuckridge. He bided his time as though he was trying to remember something he once knew. When Phyllis announced she was activating the stopwatch, he said, 25. Phyllis looked contemptuously around the hall, leaving a silence. Nora looked down at the score sheet. As everyone knows, Phyllis said, Brahms wrote 4 symphonies. 25 indeed. There was a hush at the next question. How many symphonies did Schumann write? It was the turn of the retired schoolteacher from Blackwater. I'll guess 9, he said quietly. Wrong? Phyllis said. He wrote 4. She took them then through Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Mahler, Sibelius, and Bruckner. To stunned silence as each name was called out, and each contestant failed to guess the correct number of symphonies. When she listed operas and asked them for the names of the composers, both the retired teacher and the young man from the Blackwater team knew the answers. This put Blackwater ahead by 15 points as she came to the last rounds, when the contestants could consult with each other. When one of them asked for a toilet break, Phyllis agreed. Another brandy and soda and baby sham arrived on the table. When Nora looked over towards the door, she noticed that a few men had gathered there. They were looking at herself and Phyllis with suspicion and resentment. One of them, a young man with sandy hair and a sunburned face, glanced back at his associates when he saw that Nora was watching him. As he approached her, he appeared personally aggrieved. "She's a queer big grand voice. That one," he said, nodding towards Phyllis. "I hope she's not thinking of driving through Kilmuckridge tonight, because there are a few lads are sore enough at her and the voice on her. She thinks she's someone, I'll say that for her." Nora looked away and did not reply. "I'll tell you now," he said to another man, "she'd get a great big fright if someone stuck one of her symphonies up her hole. She wouldn't be asking questions then." Phyllis whispered to Nora that they should proceed with the quiz as soon as they could. "Now, everybody," she shouted, "get ready for the last exciting rounds. Mrs. Webster will give us the score so far." The man continued to hover until Phyllis turned her full attention on him. "I'm afraid you are in the way," she said. "There's no reason for you to stand so close. Could you go back and sit down?" The man hesitated and gave her a look of pure contempt before he went back to his friends at the doorway. One of the Kilmuckridge contestants had obviously prepared for this round of questions about the prime ministers and presidents of various countries. He was able to give the names of the prime ministers of both Norway and Sweden. It was when the team was asked the name of the prime minister of the Soviet Union, and they agreed first on Brezhnev and then changed to Podgorny, that the problems arose. "Which is it?" Phyllis asked. They consulted for a while until Phyllis set a stopwatch. "It's Podgorny," one of them said. "I'm afraid you are wrong with both of your answers. The Premier of the Soviet Union is Kosygin." "You asked the name of the Prime Minister," one of them said, "and that is Kosygin. You just said he is the Premier, and that is the same as Prime Minister, and my decision is final. I'm afraid you can argue all you like. Now, next question." As murmurs came from all around, Phyllis raised her voice. "I will have no more interruptions." Nora concentrated on the score sheet and was afraid to look up. By the end of the round, since the Blackwater team had failed to answer some of the questions, there were only 3 points now between the teams. It was clear to Nora, and she presumed to people in the hall, that if the Soviet Union answer had been allowed, then Kilmuckridge would be ahead. In the last round, which focused on famous battles, each team managed to answer every question correctly. By the time the quiz ended, Nora had the score sheet totted up. Blackwater had won by 3 points. Phyllis got to her feet and demanded silence again and read out the result in an imperious voice. Before she had even time to sit down, a man emerged from the crowd and moved towards her. He was wearing a cap and a check jacket. "Where are you from?" he asked Phyllis aggressively. "What has it to do with you?" she asked. "You're not even from Enniscorthy," he said. "You're a blow-in, and you've no right to push your weight around down here." "Maybe it's time you went home," Phyllis said. "At least I know where my home is." "You robbed us," another man shouted. "That's all there is to it." Anyway, that's the first bit. If you walk south from that eroding landscape I described, and you cross the little river, you go along places called Keatings or Ballyconnick or Upper. And when we were kids, it was tremendously exciting, and I suppose it still is. I don't know if it happens as much now, where the Sisters of St. John of God have a convent between there and Curracloe. Curracloe has a much longer strand with sand dunes. It sort of changes every mile or two. And it's so like Normandy, that beach, that the movie Saving Private Ryan, that the Normandy sections were actually shot on that beach in Ireland. But as you're walking down towards Curracloe, you could before, especially when nuns wore their full habits all the time, and there were a nursing order, which meant they often had white habits, and then other days they'd have black habits. And you'd shout on the beach, "Mammy, nuns, look, nuns!" And there could be 2 nuns in full black walking along the beach, and they really looked extraordinary. They really stood out. But anyway, Nora is having, she's finally got a job. She's gone back to the job she had before she was married, and she's having a bad time there. And she's being bullied, and she finds that she's walked out one day with the scissors in her hand, the scissors that she's almost stabbed the woman she works for. She suddenly has the scissors in her hand, and it's early in the day. She hasn't been sleeping at all, so of course, like anyone with insomnia, she went to sleep just at the wrong moment, was almost late for work, had to drive the old car across the town for work. So she's there with the car and the scissors. And she can't think what to do, because it's long before the children will come home from school or anything. So she decides simply to drive where she said she'd never go, which again is this stretch of strand. She had not expected to find a haze over the water. She sat in the car in front of Keating's house and looked down in the direction of Rosslare, taking in the heavy milky light that lay over the strand going towards Curracloe and Raven Point. When she got out of the car, she felt how unusually close and humid it was, as if there was thunder coming. She put on a pair of flat shoes that she kept in the car. There were no other cars in the car park. She walked carefully on the stony stretch between the grass and the river, and crossed the small wooden bridge and made her way south. In all the years, she thought, she'd never come here even as late in the season as October. She imagined now how strange it would be in December and January, how storm-swept and wintry, and how biting the cold. There was hardly any colour. The world in front of her had been washed down. If she moved nearer to the shore, she could look at the small stones that made a rattling sound when the waves broke over them. She saw how exact the colour of each stone was, and it allowed her to forget the trouble at work and stop worrying about what she would do. She could barely see ahead of her as she walked. It might have been easy to imagine this was a place that belonged more to Morris than to her. Morris is the name, as I said, of her husband who has died. It was the world filled with absences. There was merely the hushed sound of the water and stray cries of seabirds flying close to the surface of the calm sea. She could make out the sun as it glowed through the curtain of haze. It was unlikely that Morris was anywhere except buried in the graveyard where she had left him. But nonetheless the idea lingered that if he or his spirit was anywhere in the world, then he would be here. She thought it almost natural then that if his spirit were on this stretch of strand, he would have his own concerns. The details of her life, her job, or what might happen in the future with the children, these would be matters that would seem as vague to him as the far distance did now to her, things that would pass as his life had passed. What had happened in the days before his death, the blockage in his system that caused him to cry out so his voice could be heard through the hospital, that would be with him now, more than anything else. It came to her again, his death. She pictured those who were there, Jim and Margaret, his brother and sister, Sister Thomas from the St. John of God convent, who had said special prayers, and old Father Quaid. For the last 2 days, Nora herself had stayed by his bedside, but he was already far away from them, so far that they might have been like shadows, people already lost to him. Maybe he could only imagine them all as vague presences, the ones he had loved, but love hardly mattered then, just as the haze here now meant that the line between things hardly mattered. As she reached Ballyvaloo, and the luminous grey whiteness was moved down the strand by the mild wind towards Curracloe, she saw that there was a single nun walking back towards the lane that led to the retreat house of the Sisters of St. John of God. Wearing a full black habit, she walked slowly and with difficulty. Nora thought she must be one of the retired nuns who often came here on holiday or on retreat. When she was closer, she saw that the nun was Sister Thomas. She's the nun who was at her husband's bedside. Nora was surprised. She was in Ballyvaloo. She had not known that she ever spent time away from her own convent and the town. She moved towards her, and when she reached her, Sister Thomas greeted her, put out her hands and took both of Nora's hands and held them. Suddenly Nora felt cold and began to shiver. She could hear a wind blowing, almost whistling in the distance, but when she looked out at the sea and down the strand, it all seemed calm. There was no sign of the haze lifting. You shouldn't be here on your own, Sister Thomas said. I was in Blackwater this morning to see a friend, and just a while ago she saw you fast asleep in your car and then driving towards the strand, and she phoned me in the convent because she was worried and wanted to know what she should do. So I walked down here in case I would find you. Who saw me? I thought I would come down to the shoreline, Sister Thomas went on, to see if you were here. I don't often leave the retreat house. Today it's more like heaven than earth down here. I saw her all right, Nora said. Someone who can't mind her own business. That is one way of putting it. Someone who is looking out for you. Sister Thomas released Nora's hands. I was not surprised to see you down here, she said. It was meant to happen, us meeting like this. This is how the Lord works. Don't tell me how the Lord works, Nora said. Don't tell me that again. When Morris was dying, Sister Thomas said, I asked the Lord to make it easy for him and for you. I have no needs of my own, and I had not asked him for anything in a long time. But I asked him for that, and he denied me what I asked. There must have been a reason for saying no, and the reason is hidden from us, but I know that he is watching over you. And maybe that is why we met, so I could tell you that. He has not been watching over me. No one has been watching over me. I knew, Sister Thomas said, when I woke today and said my prayers this morning, that I was to see you. Nora was silent. So turn back now, before the fog comes down so hard that you won't be able to drive home, Sister Thomas said. And go home, and the boys will be home soon. The boys will be home from school, waiting for you. I can't work in that place anymore. They shouted at me. They said things today that made it impossible for me to stay. It will be all right. It is a small town, and it will guard you. Go back to it now, and stop grieving, Nora. The time for that is over, do you hear me? I felt as I walked along here, Nora began. We all feel that on days like this, Sister Thomas interrupted, and even on other days. It is why we come here. Those who have passed on have it for shelter on their way elsewhere. It is nice to be among them on a day like this. Among them? What do you mean? We walk among them sometimes, the ones who have left us. They are filled with something that none of us knows yet. It is a mystery. She held Nora's two hands again for a moment, and then turned and walked slowly, as though in pain, back towards the dunes and the lane leading to the retreat house. Nora waited to see if she would look back, but she did not. So Nora stood for a while without moving, looking out at the sea still covered in haze, and then she began to make her way along the strand towards where she had left the car. The scissors were on the front passenger seat beside the packet of cigarettes. She put the cigarettes in the glove compartment, but took the scissors out of the car and left them down on the gravel for someone else to find. Thank you.
You'll have some questions, but we do ask you to use the microphones. There's one in the center of the floor here and one off to the side.
I think I put a damper on the whole occasion. There's somebody at the back. Yeah. Can you?
I think I can probably be heard.
Would you mind coming forward? Just come up to the microphone. We want to really hear you.
One thing that puzzled me about the book was that Nora is so secretive and prickly, and yet what you would infer about her relationship with her husband, Morris, was that it was very harmonious. Can you address that?
Yes. One of her sisters talks about that towards the end of the book, saying that she was so difficult as the eldest daughter. And again, her father had died when she was young. So bad with her mother, so really dreadful with her sisters. And the minute she met Morris, whatever it was he had in him, she just changed, especially towards him. And that what you really have to believe, I suppose, is that whatever they had was special for her. And once she's gone, she doesn't have it anymore. So she doesn't have that idea that it is. I suppose I'm trying to suggest that idea of a marriage in beginning in Ireland in the 1940s, where somehow or other she followed him. He certainly didn't follow her, and his manners were so mild, and everyone liked him so much. No one noticed that because she often says, they would go somewhere and she would like it when Morris would talk, or Morris would decide when to go home, or Morris would make all the decisions and she would sort of sit there. But no one realised that she was sitting there with her own response, which of course she wasn't making. So I was trying to suggest that sort of like deep ambiguity within her, that she's someone who under certain conditions can really soften. For example, when music comes her way, she becomes an immensely tender, soft figure. When her children are in trouble, she's soft towards them. The rest of the time, she's really difficult and often impossible. So I just wanted to get a character who you can never tell what she's going to do next. And especially now that she's been unmoored, that the anchor has gone, as it were, and she doesn't know, what to do. She doesn't know who, she doesn't know who should be her friends now, since she went everywhere with her husband. She can dart this way and dart that. And she makes a number of close friends, but slowly. She's a difficult person. And but you're absolutely right that the marriage, every mention of the marriage, is that within the marriage, it was something that simply was this sort of goal, especially as she remembers it. But she does also, at the end, wonder if Morris ever regretted marrying her. She has a feeling about herself that somehow or other, that maybe, so you're dealing with the marriage as something she remembers. I didn't go into flashback deliberately with it. It's something that's over. He's a palpable absence in the book. It was really tempting around chapter 4 to make chapter 5 a flashback of how they met or their marriage. And I decided just to let the reader imagine that. But you're absolutely right that there is that sense. You have to keep imagining the difference between Nora now and the difference between her when she was married and the difference between her now and before she married. That she's not in any way a fully stable or formed personality. She moves as each thing appears before her.
Can I ask you one other quick question? And that is, there is a person in the book who intervenes in a very helpful and productive way, surprising way, on several important occasions. And that person you made a Catholic nun. It's a surprisingly sort of heroic role for a Catholic nun to play these days. What caused you to make that choice?
Partly mischief, in the sense that now in Ireland, if you're going to if you're working as a journalist, you're investigating, things the nuns did in orphanages. The nuns are not. There are not as many nuns as there used to be, but certainly their legacy is not one that's treated with any great, respect is not the word, but I mean that there are really good reasons why people are investigating what happened in those places. And I just felt, don't jump on bandwagons, either as a citizen or as a novelist. Get your own bandwagons and for the future. Pick on your own, make up, but certainly in a novel, just don't follow the flow with that. Almost see if there's a way of going against it and finding if the least likely person who, as you say, pulls the strings and seems to operate out of an immense amount of kindness and also has a funny sort of power in the town which he uses very carefully. But that was done, if I had written this novel maybe 30, 40 years ago, I would have seen reason to have a really ignominious sort of nun. But now, you're kicking them when they're down, and it makes no dramatic sense because the reader says, "Oh yeah, here he is as usual," kick the nun, and but not kicking the nun actually creates a sort of drama in the book, and it's there deliberately.
Thank you.
I was going to wait till the end since this is about another one of your books, but since no one else came up, I was fascinated by your book, The Testament of Mary. I felt like there was such an understanding of women in that book and such a different way of looking at Mary that was so much more real than what I was brought up with by the good sisters. Did you get any flack from the Catholic Church about that book?
And in America, I did. They shipped up or bussed up from Pennsylvania a group to protest outside the theatre in Broadway on the opening night and on the preview night. But they didn't know what I looked like. Thank God, you know. And so I was able to go over and ask them, well, what's going on? And I'm not making this up, I promise you. But one guy said to me, "There's a blasphemous movie on in there." I said, "Oh, really? A blasphemous movie?" And so I went, you know, but nobody interrupted the play as it went on. I got emails because I have a website and you can click on contact, and I got abusive emails, and some of them called me names, and some of the names were true. And I have all those emails because there is sort of an interesting photograph of what people will do under those pressures. Ireland, however, is a different, what we call kettle of fish. People are very tactful and careful and watchful. And there was so much censorship and anger before against writers. You know, Edna O'Brien's book was burned in her village. John McGahern's books were banned. You know, this is only in recent times. I mean, this is the first half of the 1960s. People are not going to do that again. So the only outrage that occurred, and it's a very typical Irish outrage now, was on one of the preview nights in the theatre when the play was on in the Dublin Theatre Festival. I was walking up because I was still making little changes, and I saw at the edge of a row the most eminent moral theologian in Ireland, which means one of the most eminent in the world. I mean, this guy means business, and his books are widely, you know, he's really important. And it being Ireland, of course, I know him. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I just, you know, wanted to see what you were doing, and it was very mild, and, you know, so I said, oh my God. And I was sitting through the play. All I was thinking about was, oh my God, this is going to be awful for him. You know, I think, you know, but afterwards, he just looked at me on the way out and smiled, and he was still smiling, and that he's a wonderful man, a priest. And he said, so, he said, in that Irish way, so. And I said, and he said, well, you know, it was really looked wonderful, but the thing is, at my age, my hearing is really going. And so I didn't hear most of it, but it looked marvellous, and congratulations. And then he walked by me. And as if to say, if you think you're going to get a story to tell everyone about the priests of Ireland attacking you that gets into the papers, I'm not giving you a moment's peace on this. And he walked away, and I would imagine when he got outside, he had his little laugh to himself at what he had just done, which was so tactful, as well as being so oddly pointed. And you know, so that really was the Irish response.
Well, I, in my book club, loved your book.
Oh, thank you very much.
If I may, I think we're on a theme here, the Catholic theme. But first, I just have to say on another book, The Master, one of the most beautiful novels I've ever read. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But I brought with me this Love in a Dark Time, which I found very interesting, of the gay writers, the famous gay writers that you write about. And your last chapter is Goodbye to Catholic Ireland, where you talk about the church in Ireland, which I see very much as a church in this country, not a church of compassion, but a church of coercion and control. So I wonder if that is changing in Ireland, and particularly given what we heard from the Vatican this week from Pope Francis, how Pope Francis is being received among the Irish clergy.
I mean, the first thing is that the sex abuse scandal has really affected everybody. But you have to just imagine it from the point of view of the priests, where people who were so respected and so wanted in the streets, and so, you know, wearing and suddenly it became a time when they were almost afraid to walk in their full regalia on the streets. And the churches, of course, were dwindling, and they must have noticed, for example, the money people were paying to the churches were dwindling. But what's strange is, you know, I think if you ask the right questions in an opinion poll, I actually got control about 20 years ago of an opinion poll in Ireland, where I was working as a journalist, and I was trying to get out of working that week, and he said to me, what's going on? Like, what is the big subject coming our way, the editor said. And I said, I was trying to think of something that he would say, no, we don't want that in the paper. And I said, I think gay marriage is really going to be a big one. He said, gay marriage. He said, okay, gay marriage. Let's do a poll on that. And will you write the questions? So obviously the first question would be, would you, but the last question I put in was, if your son or daughter were getting married to a person of the same sex, would you attend the party afterwards? And I got a majority for that. And that led me to believe that it's the question rather than the answer that almost matters here. And so I think if you asked questions in Ireland about actual faith and the afterlife and what people actually believe about the world, you'd find that probably nothing has shifted and nothing has changed. But if you ask people about, say, contraception or the power of the priest in their lives or what they think about their, that's all changed. So the surface things have changed. But I don't think the matter of faith has changed. And I think Francis is interesting in this regard in that he understands if you could tap into the faith question and get all the other stuff out of the way, even if you don't want to, even if you have to drag certain cardinals kicking and screaming into the 29th century, that you could actually renew the church and get something very funny going if you went back to the business of prayer, faith, what you really believe. So it's a very, very interesting time. And it'll be very interesting to see how he can do this. He's going very far at the moment because he not only has the synod, but he's controlling the press. He has sent people out every day to leak. The leaks are sensationally interesting. And the other side, of course, don't understand the press and they keep away from journalists. So they're not leaking with the same persistent amount of skill. So it's a very interesting business, and it just could take that business that he's talking about all the time, that issue of bringing back the spiritual and taking away about 10 rules that will go at some point anyway, and they might as well go soon, but it'll be hard. It'll be a battle.
Hi, from the book The South through Nora Webster, many of the characters that you present are women in transition, and they're also mostly the protagonists in those books. I was wondering if you could give us sort of your look at women in transition, where the root of this comes from, and how you developed it over time.
I have written other books like the Henry James book and the Heather Blazing. There are other.
I know. I've read
I'm
this,
not.
But women in
I'm not a stuck needle, although I am reasonably stuck. The answer to that is that it's personal, that it comes from my own life, and that it comes from a time when maybe I was starting to read and starting to think about writing. When my father died when I was 12, and which happens to Donal in this book, and the business of being alone in a house then with my mother, myself and my younger brother were there with her for a few years, and of course. The funny thing about a page when you're writing is a page is not a mirror. It's blank, and you have to fill it. And you don't see yourself in it, so that you need to put something into it. And it was almost easier, or it was easier, for me to imagine, or begin to imagine, somebody in her circumstances in the Ireland of those years than it was for me to imagine myself. Because I couldn't see anyone in some of those years if I looked in the mirror. It was almost as though part of me was missing or hollowed out in some way. And there was so much silence surrounding things that everybody was thinking about that you didn't know what words would ever matter again. And then words became something that I thought I could make matter. But so I saw that, I lived with that, and it stayed with me. And there are a few times over the years when I came across a book that I thought would... there's an Irish short story writer who published many stories in the New Yorker called Mary Lavin, and she also had lost her husband in her 40s, and she wrote some wonderful stories about being a widow. Well, when I met her first and read those stories first, I was as though, it was as though I had actually for the first time come across something real and true. And I came across it again in something like even D.H. Lawrence in Sons and Lovers, with that idea of the woman at home who is not being educated to match her great intelligence, and the sort of frustration that arises from that. Or the last sections of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, when the husband has died and the mother is there with the son, and what begins to work for them is music, and they're healed or even alienated further by music. Or even more particularly Bergman's film Fanny and Alexander, where the husband dies and the young widow has 2 children as here with her, and the boy Alexander sort of watches everything to know who's going to disappear next, as though. And so finding those images in other work really mattered to me. And almost out of reading and out of the fact that what happens is a curious thing, that an image or something that matters to you, a memory, something you've heard, something you're uncertain about, which you know is important, comes to you as rhythm in a way nothing else does. So you could decide you should write a novel about Napoleon, but it wouldn't come. You get a first sentence, it'd be all wrong, and you wouldn't go on with it. But with this, every time it's come to me as rhythm, almost as though it's melody, and I can work with it because it somehow or other matters to me. I'm working out of something elemental, or at least that has mattered to me. So for that reason, I have found metaphors for that business of a woman in her 40s who has lost her husband, and I have then in this book attempted to go there directly, close enough, back to the town. The house is very much the house we grew up in. I have made a tapestry in a way of using 2 sorts of wool. One is memory and the other is invention, and I have sort of wove them together to see. But the first thing that came to me was rhythm.
I thought that in this book and also in Brooklyn, you presented protagonists who were women who were largely who were propelled toward major life decisions by other persons. In the case of Eilis, by Rose and her mother, and by the priest in Brooklyn, and by the woman back in Enniscorthy who knows about her marriage. And in this case, Nora is led back to music and is invited to to participate in the quiz competition that you described by other people. She's sort of being led, and she responds to all of this. But I was struck by what I thought was the similarity in the characters of both protagonists, and I wondered if you agreed or if that was a theme you were interested in developing.
Yeah. I suppose the idea would be that you have to make drama. That, I mean, especially this book is reasonably plotless. It isn't as though there's a big fire or they all go running down. There's a revolution. It's just something. So therefore, there has to be drama, and the drama is between the inner life and the one that's led by others. So that Nora, in the way she notices, feels, remembers, lives within herself, has an enormous strength, as Eilis in Brooklyn does. But nobody sees that sometimes. They see someone who's just waiting to be bullied, or waiting to be ordered, or waiting to be helped. They don't see the inner thing, but the reader sees both. And so the tension is always going on between this business, which I think you find, certainly I find it in, say, Jane Austen, even in Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, or in Pride and Prejudice, that idea of the light within that sometimes shows, sometimes doesn't, but matters enormously to the person themselves, a sort of grace they have. And then the person who appears, who may not appear as strong, because no one knows what they're really thinking. So that sort of drama is going on in the 2 books. So I'm going to say one last question here. Yeah.
The Master is one of my all-time favorite books, and what you've managed to do for me is capture longing for the entire book. And some people can't describe it in a sentence, much less keep it going for so long. So I'm curious what invention or memory was the touchstone that sparked it. Is there...
He just came in. I started to read about him previously, having just read the books, and realized this extraordinary life lived. Again, that inner business of the mind who creating with such an amount of glittering skill, and the figure himself so oddly frozen emotionally, and what that must have been like on given days for him as he got older and realized that perhaps on some days at least he would have exchanged. He would have made the novels all dull, quiet, strange and withdrawn if he himself could have known one great love or one great adventure. And so the life that idea of going, I suppose also anyone who ever gets to be middle-aged wonders, was there something else I should have done? Should I have, just had a much better time, especially if you're a writer where you think everyone else. It happens to me sometimes in Dublin on a Friday where I'm walking home from the supermarket at exactly the wrong time when everyone else is coming out of work, and they're all drinking outside and they're all laughing. The weekend is coming, and I'm going home to my book. I haven't, I don't have that schedule, and I look at them all and think, oh my God, I'd love to be you. Even if you have been locked up in an office all week, I'd love to be you now. Look at you all. Whereas what am I doing? Going home to my... So, that sort of tension between the life you live and the life you might have lived. Thank you very much. Thank you.